Notice requirements of the notice requirements of the Open Public Meetings Act have been satisfied by the placing of the notice of this meeting on the bulletin board at the municipal building, filing the notice with the township clerk, and transmitting the notice to the Hunterdon County Democrat, the Courier News, the Star Ledger, and the Trend Times.
Okay, thank you. We are fortunate this evening to have folks from the Board of Adjustment here with us this evening. Thank you for our working meeting at the end of the agenda. So as Taylor goes through the roll call, she's going to include all of you folks on the board, okay? Taylor?
All right, Chairman, Mr. Edward Gettings.
Here.
Vice Chairwoman, Ms. Donna Drews.
Here.
Mayor, Ms. Robin Fatu.
Here.
Mr. Scott McDade.
Here.
Ms. Judy DeJohn Domenico.
Here.
Ms. Michelle Cavalieri.
Here.
Ms. Lisa Fania. She is asked to be excused. Mr. James Miller.
Here.
And Mr. Glenn Sokolowski, he asked to be excused as well. For professionals, Board Attorney, Mr. John Bellardo.
Here.
Township Landscape Architect, Mr. John Morgan Thomas has asked to be excused. Traffic Consultant, Mr. Jay Troutman, asked to be excused. Township Planner, Mr. Jeffrey Vaccarella.
Here.
Board Planner, Ms. Jessica Caldwell. Here. And Township Engineer, Mr. Paul Ferrero, has asked to be excused as well. For Board of Adjustment, Chairman, Mr. Roger Aarons.
Here.
Vice Chair, Ms. Cynthia Schaefer.
Here.
Mr. Randy Block.
Here.
And Vice Chair Pro Temp, Mr. Bradford Perry.
Here.
And Board Attorney, Mr. John Drill.
Here.
Very good. Thank you. Next up on the agenda are approval of minutes from our February 8th, 2023 meeting. Those have been circulated prior to our meeting this evening. Does anyone have any questions or comments on the minutes?
I had a question.
Sure.
Did they ask, in where it says about being hooked up to sewer? Actually, I thought they had said hooked up to sewer, yet in the minutes it said to expand the capacity of the septic. Does anybody have a recollection as to which one it was? Because I thought it was hooking up to the sewer authority.
I seem to recall them saying they had asked to hook up to the sewer, but there wasn't capacity. So
They've
they were
asked-
gonna be
they asked
forced to
multiple
search the
times.
septic.
Oh, okay.
I believe that's the
That's right.
February 22nd minutes.
Yeah,
On-
well, yeah.
And that's on Hunterdon Land Trust.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, they're trying to-
February.
Sorry.
Yeah, so they're doing the 8th version.
My bad.
All right, so we'll stick to the 8th and we'll come back to that.
8th look good.
Okay.
Motion to move.
Second?
Chairman, Mr. Edward Gettings.
Yes.
Vice Chairwoman, Ms. Donna Drews.
Yes.
Mayor, Ms. Robin Fatu.
Yes.
Mr. Scott McDade.
Yes.
Ms. Judy DeJohn Domenico.
Yes.
Ms. Michelle Cavalieri.
I was actually absent.
And
For that
Mr.
one.
James Miller.
That's why.
Okay, thanks. So let's go to the next item, which is the February 22nd, 2023 minutes. And just pick up on your point, Michelle, on,
It's
What's
fine.
the-
It was clarified. I was incorrect
because
in my
that's my
recollection.
recollection too.
So,
They asked multiple
Yeah.
times.
gotcha.
Right, but I think it's on page 4 of 8, second sentence, upgrade to the septic system. It would be the appropriate language there.
Oh, not tank.
Right, yeah.
Mhm. That's a good change. Taylor, do you have that?
Mhm.
Okay, great. Okay. Any other comments or concerns? No. Have a motion to approve with the change that Ms. Drews just made. Motion to approve February 22nd.
I was just saying motion.
Thank you, Scott.
Second.
Chairman, Mr. Edward Gettings.
Yes.
Vice Chairwoman, Ms. Donna Drews.
Yes.
Mayor, Ms. Robin Fatu.
Yes.
Mr. Scott McDade.
Yes.
Ms. Judy DeJohn Domenico.
Yes.
Ms. Michelle Cavalieri.
Yes.
Mr. James Miller.
Yes.
Thank you. Next up on our agenda is citizens' privilege. I do not know, Taylor, if we have anybody remotely with us this evening.
There's one person remotely.
Okay, well, if you're remote or in the room with us and you want to address the planning board about something that's not further down on the agenda, now would be a good time to do so. Please stand up to the microphone and let us have your name and address. Okay.
Lance Dunn, 809 Reed Court. This is just a general question. I don't know if this is something for the planning board, but maybe you can point me in the right direction. I'm looking for data or statistics on apartment units either in development or planned. Is that a number that is recorded or available?
Well, it's recorded. Affordable housing units or just
Affordable and
apartments?
market. Because I work in real estate, so this kind of would help me in my business as I work with investors who are
Mhm.
looking to.
My suggestion would be if you're seeking that information, we have an Open Public Records Act in New Jersey. You can fill out a form.
Yep.
And you can request documents or government records from the clerk, Ms. Fania. That would be the best way to go about doing that.
So get an Oprah through the clerk?
Yeah,
open
I
to
think
the
it's
clerk.
probably on the website, the form.
Yeah. Okay, but the clerk's the person to go to.
Yes. yes.
Okay.
She's normally
I
here.
would
She's not
suggest
here
that
this
you
evening.
ask for our annual monitoring reports for affordable housing, because even though it just focuses on affordable, it has market units in there as well.
What's it called?
Probably the best one would be the midpoint review. There's a spreadsheet that has all the apartment projects that were approved and where
Okay.
they're at and how many units. I mean, get you pretty far, wouldn't get you everything.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, there being nothing on others, we do not have any public hearings this evening, but what we do have next up is Resolution 8-2023. This is the Hunterdon Land Trust. And we had received this and another resolution earlier for review.
Both of these are from the last meeting, the February 22nd meeting that both were approved at.
Any comments or concerns from the board on the resolution?
Looks good.
They look good to me too. I'll like to move that they're approved.
Second?
Chairman, Mr. Edward Gettings,
Yes.
Vice Chairwoman, Ms. Donna Drews.
Yes.
Mayor, Ms. Robin Fatu.
Yes.
Mr. Scott McDade,
Yes.
Ms. Judy D. John Domenico,
Yes.
Ms. Michelle Kapakiri,
Yes.
Mr. James Miller.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Next up, as John said from the last meeting, is Resolution 9-2023. This is Sanatana Dharma Foundation. Approval of the resolution. Any comments or changes to the resolution? No. Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Chairman, Mr. Edward Gettings,
Yes.
Vice Chairwoman, Ms. Donna Drews.
Yes.
Mayor, Ms. Robin Fatu.
Yes.
Mr. Scott McDade,
Yes.
Ms. Judy D. John Domenico,
Yes.
Ms. Michelle Kapakiri,
Yes.
Mr. James Miller.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We did receive some correspondence that was circulated to the planning board. First item up is the Hunterdon County Planning Board, a comprehensive farmland preservation plan, and there's a public hearing coming up on that shortly on April 6th. And the information we received would give us the ability to join that meeting. I believe it's 8:15 in the morning. Take a look at it. So. And the other are two pieces of. Was that you?
I said, I guess they don't want people to come.
I guess not.
Yeah, it's an ideal date and
Yeah.
time, right?
I,
those who
I looked
work.
at that, I read it, I'm like, oh, great, at 8:15 in the evening, a little late, but sure.
8:15 in the morning, that's so good. And we have two things coming into us. Excuse me. From ELP, applications for freshwater wetlands, letter of interpretation. And so that's informational for us. Okay. Next up for discussion and recommendation are a review of the proposed amendments to Chapter 296, the Land Development Code of the revised general ordinances of the township, which for those of us who have it, it certainly passes the weight test, Jessica. So there's an awful lot going on here. So we want to take a look at this evening. I should say that several of us had heard from Karen Gilbert at the beginning of the meeting, and her request was that we focus on, as we go through this, the overall policy concerns and goals, and not necessarily the language on specific ordinances. So I think Karen's input is certainly welcome. She sat on this board for a long time and certainly was the township committee person for a long time. So With that, we're going to throw this out to Jessica Caldwell. And Jeff, you are going to be taking minutes as well on this, right? On any recommendations or any comments. So,
Good evening, and thank you for everyone for coming and to this joint meeting tonight. So I'm going to go through and put together a PowerPoint to kind of try to give some background and information and help guide us through this meeting tonight so we can try to be as productive as possible. So this is really a review of commercial ordinances. Just to go over what we're going to discuss tonight, I'm going to give an introduction and overview of the ordinance revision, goals of the revision as they started out, and then go into a policy discussion. We're hoping for sort of broad level policy guidance, input from the board members here and any public who wishes to join in, and then a plan to complete the project, which includes requesting a subcommittee of one or both boards. So by way of introduction, this project was really started by an application for a grant to the Hunterdon County Economic Development Commission. In December 2019, there was a grant awarded to the township. And in conjunction with that, the township issued an RFP for revisions to the ordinance, which I responded to. The project was awarded to my firm in January of 2020, and we began work on the revision in February of 2020. We produced some draft ordinance revisions that were given to essentially the township engineer, township zoning officer at the time, and Don Hutchins were doing reviews. We went through a couple revisions, and what you've seen, what's been distributed was from September 2020, after a few of those revisions went through. I think for a variety of reasons, I'm not exactly clear, but the project was put on hold. And I didn't really hear about it until November of 2021. When Karen Gilbert, the township administrator, asked me to prepare a revised scope to kind of revive the grant. I think the grant was going to lapse or be taken away, or we weren't going to be able to complete the grant. So I prepared a scope essentially to revive the project, look at the ordinances again, meet with the subcommittee and get feedback, and then eventually, finish some draft ordinances for the township to approve. I haven't done any work on that proposed scope. I know that the ordinance from 2020 was distributed to the planning board and the zoning board. There's been some internal reviews and some internal comments on one of the drafts that's been circulated as well. So what we're really doing now is looking to restart this ordinance review process. So I don't want anyone to think that these are, going to be adopted next week. These are really sort of things that were floating around as discussion items, which is why we're really asking for, higher level input rather than, finite granular input at this point. Just by way of background.
if I can interrupt, Jessica, is there a window that this has to be completed on, given that grant?
I think it's getting tight, but we may have to ask for some additional
Okay.
time. But I think it's more important to do it right than it is to try to, have the grant lead
I
us
agree.
too much. So I think if we show that we're really making an effort, hopefully we can continue on this process that we'll have to look into. So I just want to give the overall goals of, at least at the time we got the grant, of what, what the focus was. So it's been almost, 3 years, 2.5 years have gone by. A lot of things have changed. That was kind of, we started right before COVID happened, obviously. So that was, one of the things that was just, why we started in January, but no meetings till September, obviously, because things were kind of in a state of disarray. So Some of the overarching goals of the project were really, because it was a Hunterdon County Economic Development Authority, obviously, we're looking to improve overall business climate in the township. And the ideas were to look at ways to attract and retain business, improve the zoning and land use process for businesses, alleviate ordinance conflicts and outdated zoning concepts, reduce the cost of securing land use approvals, and modernize the ordinance to ensure a vibrant economic environment. So those were all things that were, in the grant when it was started. And then I also, saw news articles and things from around that time, and things that, both, policymakers on both sides from Hunterdon County and Raritan Township, these were the types of things that were being talked about with respect to this grant and what it could do for the municipality. So because of that, what we really looked at were commercial ordinances. Obviously, we weren't looking at, things that impact residential uses, although those are worthy as well. It just wasn't part of this project. So some of the goals that we looked at, given that scope and those overarching goals of the project, that we looked at to, how can we do that? This is all through the lens of a land use ordinance. So how can we improve, business climate through the land use ordinance, and, how do we improve the economic environment, and how do we impact that through the land use ordinance? So we looked at reviewing and updating definitions to alleviate confusion and vagueness in the ordinance, to define new and updated uses and ordinance provisions. So a lot of times when you're thinking of something, a certain type of use, industrial, and, just nothing is ever like black and white. It's always gray. Things come in. Is this industrial? Does it meet this definition? Maybe there's not a good definition in the ordinance. So those types of things where it helps to clarify and helps to move people through the process if you have a good set of definitions. And that's always what the zoning officers fall back on when they're trying to figure out, is something permitted, is it not permitted? And then you go straight to the definitions. We looked at the industrial zones and how we could potentially update the uses and clarify the uses in the industrial zones. Looking at mixing uses, perhaps, looking at multiple principal uses, perhaps, and where those might be permitted. We talked a lot about flex spaces and, whether those should be permitted. They have been in the past, but there was some interpretations of the ordinance that wasn't necessarily permitted anymore. Was that the intent? Industrial parks are referenced in the ordinance, but not really clear how it's permitted. So things like that to try to clarify what's permitted, where are they permitted, how, and do we want them to go through a planning board process, or do we want them to go through, take their chances at the zoning board? And things like recreational uses in industrial zones has come up over time. Should those be permitted? Is that something, are there certain areas where that would work or not? Also in the commercial zones, looking at clarifying and updating uses, similar types of things like mixed uses. How can uses mix together? Are multiple principal and accessory uses okay? They have been in the past. There's, numerous developments that have been approved with multiple principal uses. And then, there's an interpretation of the zoning board where now everything goes to the zoning board if it has multiple principal uses. So where, should those be permitted, and where would they be permitted? And then looking at also where and how to consider potentially additional residential uses within commercial zones. And just overall updating and modernizing permitted uses. A lot of ordinances have things like, printing shops, and nobody has printing shops anymore. So, so making sure that, the types of things that people are applying for are referenced and permitted in the zones. We also looked at, off-street parking standards. Are they current and consistent with IT standards? Are we, right-sizing parking lots? Do they, we don't want to over ask on parking lots, and we don't want to under ask. So we want to look at, are we asking for the right amount of parking? Are they updated? Are they updated and correlated with the uses that are permitted in the zones? And then potentially, a lot of what we put in there was just to get people thinking. There's shared parking. You can have shared parking standards. Is that something that the municipality would be interested in order to reduce and right-size parking, and particularly in commercial areas where there are a lot of different uses? Also, outdoor dining obviously became a big thing, especially during COVID, and a lot of municipalities looked at ways to continue that. And so we, put in a section on outdoor dining. Some municipalities want to, regulate a little more, some regulate less. This, what we put in there had an annual license renewal process. That could be right for Raritan, maybe it's not. But to think about ways to allow outdoor dining that people really like it, and it helps to bolster restaurants and the economy. And then just how do we revise or look at and clarify and simplify the overall land use process for businesses, and it would help, individuals as well. And we proposed a technical review committee that would look at completeness for applications, and then also provide review and some process and just some assistance and upfront guidance through the land use process. Also clarifying minor site plans, site plan exemptions, and potentially waivers. When is site plan required? Can someone get a site plan waiver? Are there, what are the exemptions from site plan, and what makes sense? And that's something that's even come up again recently that I think Attorney Bellardo will address later on. But just looking at those types of things, like, are all the applications coming to the board, the applications that we want to see, or are there things coming before the board that we really don't want to see? Or are there things not coming to the board that we do want to see? So those are, those are the types of things that we want to look at and get some clarity to. And also things like the application checklists, and are those up to date, and are we asking for the things that we want to see, and not over asking? Or there are times when minor site plan checklists that can be more appropriate. So those were the overarching goals of the draft, the things that we were trying to get at. So from a policy discussion perspective, our goal tonight is to get guidance on, like I said, on a general overarching policy guidance direction. And we don't want to get in the weeds too much because it's, it's a big document, so we really can't do the whole thing tonight. But those of you who really would love to jump into the weeds with us can think about volunteering for our subcommittee later on. But from an overall perspective, and thinking as a planner, like the way we like to look at these things, and just to give you a way to think about, I was thinking, how do we elicit, your thoughts on these? Because I think a lot of people are looking at this document and going, what do you want me to tell you? So it's like, from our current ordinance, when you think about it and you think about how our process works as the municipality, what do you think the strengths are? What do you think are some of the weaknesses? And where do we have opportunities? And what are some of the threats given, our current status today? And then think of the flip side, with all these goals in mind, what would you look at in terms of an updated ordinance? What would the strengths of that be? What could it be? What could be the weaknesses? What are some of our opportunities we could create? And what are some of the threats in doing, this update? So I think, if you can, I think with those two, buckets in mind, we'd like to welcome your input on this process.
Does the master plan drive some of this, or would this impact ultimately changes to the master plan?
It does overall. I mean, because it has overarching policy guidance. But I think when you get into ordinances, it's very specific. So, I mean, the extent that, a commercial zone is a commercial zone, but what commercial uses are permitted in that zone is a little more granular and not necessarily spelled out in a master plan.
Well, why don't we kick it over to you guys first? If you have any thoughts, questions?
Jessica, have we ever elicited comments from people who have gone through the process? Individual homeowners, business owners, asking them what they found most arduous or what they found easiest in this process?
Not
Because
to my
sometimes
knowledge, yeah.
the best people to get that information from, what we're talking about here, are the very people that have gone through the process. I don't know. I have a relatively new home. I've had to ask Jeff one or two questions because I've wanted to make some changes in my home, require a zoning permit or a building permit. And I'm just curious if we ever elicited that kind of information from people who have done both.
How specific do you want to get? Because you as a board, you heard from, the board has had a massive amount of C variance impervious coverage for homeowners cases. A massive amount over the last 2 years. In fact, the board in their annual report suggested, and the 2022 report's not out yet, it's going to be next month, but they suggested that the township committee increase the impervious coverage, and they did a little. Once the township committee increased it, we figured that that would stop it. Now people are coming in asking for even more than the increase. So that's an area that you guys know homeowners have been complaining about. Now, I don't know what recommendation, if any, to make about that, but that's one thing that homeowners complain about. Can I keep on? Okay, one of the things that Jessica asks in here is whether or not there should be a technical review committee, at least from the Board of Adjustments perspective. And I'm speaking on behalf of the board, but if I misspeak, you guys tell me. They think that that would be a very bad idea. The Board of Adjustment likes how Jeff does the completeness reviews, because if you have a technical coordinating committee, these guys have been meeting twice a month for 2 years. Their docket is huge. You guys are like, don't take this wrong, you're on vacation. That you meet, once every 3 months or something. And I'm not saying this to insult anybody, but these guys are being worked to the bone. They don't want to have to sit on a technical review committee.
Sure.
And completeness is just, have they submitted a document that is called for on the checklist, not whether it's sufficient, not whether, if you put in, if it says traffic report, technically, if someone puts in a piece of paper and it says traffic report on it, might be an over exaggeration, but they might be complete. What the Board of Adjustment has done, the Board of Adjustment has started to bounce applicants. So they're technically complete, and the board agrees with Jeff. You know what? Nothing you can do about it. They're complete. But the documents, either stormwater is, not up to snuff, traffic, they haven't done something, the board doesn't, and then the expert reports come in, and the board engineering expert has like 45 comments on revisions. So the chairman will call up Jeff and say, listen, call up the applicant, tell them they should adjourn. So that didn't go too well in the beginning. Applicants were coming in. So then the board started bouncing them, and they would embarrass the attorney, their engineer, and the applicant on the record. And all of a sudden, it took about 6 months. Now the word has gotten out. So now, at least from the Board of Adjustment, if Jeff calls and says, hey, the chairman says that, you got to get your documents up to snuff, we suggest that you put it off. They're starting to put it off.
Jonathan, just so you know, we've experienced the same thing, and we've pushed back also. And we've had a number of applications get postponed, still being postponed, right, Jeff?
Correct.
Because
But
they still
that's-
don't come in to the level of
Right. But that's why
completeness.
the technical review committee will just, in my opinion, will just add to the applicant's cost. And it will add to, unless you guys have nothing better to do, it will add to the amount of time you're going to have to put in, and you're going to be making these non-binding recommendations in any event, and they either will or won't listen. So that's the extent of my input at this point, is just on homeowners are complaining about the impervious coverage, the requirement's too low. And You just have to get tough.
Mhm.
And if you don't like what you see in an application and you think it'd be a waste of time to hear it, and just like you said, just bounce.
Well, the other thing is to beef up the checklist ordinance.
You mean the checklist?
Yes. Say, okay, we want a stormwater management report that consists of A, B, C, D, and E.
Right. And if
And
you
then
put
if
the
they don't,
AB,
if they
that's
don't
right.
give that, it's not complete.
That's
That's the
correct.
way to do it.
Yeah, and that's something I would strongly encourage because exactly like you said, a solicitor, that, we want to make sure we can move forward and not waste our time as board members, not waste the applicant's time and professionals' time showing up for meetings and having to be adjourned and postponed.
So if you want
So I-
Jeff to be your gate guard, then you got to give him the A, B, C, and D under it, and not just list the stormwater report.
Right.
Then he can bounce.
Well, that would be an ordinance amendment.
Correct,
Right.
right.
But
Could
I
I
think,
ask,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, Donna.
I believe is what you guys just talked about.
For the-
I would like to ask two quick questions to narrow the focus of this discussion.
Sure.
And the first is for Jessica. Am I correct in my understanding that the focus of this project at this point is on commercial and industrial zones?
Correct.
And residential only like as a kind of a byproduct of that discussion?
I suppose so, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I'm not saying that it's not a good idea to do any of the residential improvements. It just wasn't part of the scope of this project.
And if I could ask the chairman of Board of Adjustment, because I'm not familiar with the scope and nature of your work necessarily. We've heard about the incredible increase and we've discussed the incredible increase in your caseload. Is that, can you say at this point that that's predominantly due to residential applications, or is it predominantly due to commercial and industrial?
It's about
applications?
equally divided.
14 and 18.
And you can see, we handed out the 2021 annual report. It gives you a list of every single account of every single application that came into the BOA. And in a month, we'll have 2022. You'll see it's about the same. A whole bunch of residential impervious coverages, and then a whole bunch of use variances.
But let me
So
add,
part of the,
a caveat to that comment that I made about being equally divided. The commercial ones take far longer than the residential ones. We usually move through a residential application in an evening, but the commercial ones, the Wawa case, for instance. How many, 12?
12. I mean, the billboard on Route 206, we're up to number 10. It's going to be finally deliberated and voted on next month.
It's been going on for a year. Or more.
So the number of cases is about the same, but the volume of the work that's generated
Correct.
is industrial, commercial.
Absolutely.
so, and I would point out that, part of the scope of this work is that a lot of these, like they said, are use variances. So are these uses, all uses that the governing body, planning board, everybody wants to go to zoning board? There's nothing going to planning board right now. It seems like everything's going to zoning board. And to
If
me,
you guys,
that's
if you guys
concern.
amend the ordinance to make flex spaces permitted, you can have all the flex applications, and you'll probably take 4 to 6 applications off their docket.
So the root cause is that our definition of purpose is not clear enough, and then it gets kicked to BOA.
Let me just give a little bit more. There are right now probably 10 or 12 planning board applications that are waiting to be heard. It just so happens that whoever's preparing that application, they're not submitting time. There are multiple ones that are waiting. It just so happens that a lot of applications that are going for board adjustment, they're on the ball. They're submitting whenever there's a so, and I think a lot of applications that are going to the board of adjustment were heard by the board of adjustment from back in like the 90s, and they wanted to improve.
I want to expand.
So correct me if I'm wrong, if the board of adjustment hears that.
Once they grant the D variance, they got jurisdiction over anything that happens with it, unless you recommend that the township committee makes the non-permitted use permitted. Then they would kick over to you.
Also, let me add too, that usually when the residential applications come before us, usually people are applying for one variance. C1 or a C2, maybe a D1. But when we get a commercial application, we've had 7, 8, 9
Variances or exceptions,
variances.
multiple.
Barlow was 18. Yeah. So, I mean, it's obvious that the commercial ones are so much more intensive.
I'll say one of the things, my personal theory, this is not a professional opinion, my personal theory on why the BOA is getting a lot of these big commercial applications is because if it goes to the planning board, it's permitted. If it's permitted, presumably the price that whoever owns that property is selling it for is more than if someone comes into the Board of Adjustment where they need a D variance. So it's not permitted. So therefore, the seller is willing to take less money, but it's not a contingency. That's why, so a lot of these businesses that would otherwise could find something that's permitted somewhere, it financially makes sense for them to try to go to the BOA for a D variance because it's cheaper to get the land.
But
We have a real
the
estate broker in the audience.
The
Can we
flex
make it cost
space
more to go to
uses
BOA?
though are all in industrial, really, industrial zone.
Right,
So
right. The flex space is different. If you would amend the ordinance to make flex permitted, they'd really appreciate it.
Do we also
Yeah,
need
but
to
do we
define
want
what flex means
Yeah,
though?
'cause
Because
that's
that's been very
vague.
nebulous
Yes.
as well.
You're right.
And
That's
it's
up to you.
it's funny because there's parking standards for flex spaces and there's some standards for flex space, but there's no definition and there's nowhere that it says that it's permitted. But I think over time, a lot of what's changed, I think, into creating more variances is interpretations of the ordinance changes over time. So I see applications that were before planning board that are later before zoning board because they have multiple principal uses, but it was approved by planning board in the beginning. So it's things like that, and changes of interpretation over time as well, change how, where it goes with which board. So I think those are some of the things to clear up. And I would say with respect to technical review committee, it does offer an opportunity to speak informally with applicants and let them know about the board's preferences for things like thorough stormwater reports and things that the board likes to see. And while some people don't listen, my experience with municipalities that have them is a lot of applicants take it to heart. And so they will do the things they need to do to try to get before the board and minimize their time before the board. Because if you think about it, anytime an applicant's before a board and they have 4 professionals out there, they're probably spending at least $1,000 an hour to sit here. So the less time they have to do that, the better if you're interested in, making economic environment better. I know there was even, some discussion about should we charge for TRC? Oh, maybe you don't, but where the really costing the applicants is all this time in the meetings. And just by going before the zoning board, you're telling an applicant that you don't want their use. So if there are applications going before the zoning board where, the governing body would say, we do want that use, then it shouldn't be going before the zoning board. And also what you don't see are all the applications that don't come in. Because I know plenty of developers and people who work in land use who aren't even going to touch a use variance. So they're not going to come in, they're not going to do anything,
I guess go ahead, Jeff. I guess one of the things, it seems like there's one bucket of things, if we're talking about how to make the process clearer, simpler, and more efficient for our boards and for applicants, is really focusing in on some of the areas where we can, shift, like, I don't think we haven't amended the solar ordinance yet, for example, and some of those kind of things where, there might be easy lift items where we can go in and modify, reduce workload, make things easier and more efficient, that are more procedural in nature. And I think where my concern is, the technical review committee as structured in the proposed revision is a very intensive process, with the mandatory meetings and those types of things. Our ordinance currently does have the ability for an applicant to request
A concept review. That's
Yes.
right.
Yes, and in the past, I know our board has, I've sat on the committee and we've done reviews with applicants and their professionals and given some general suggestions. So part of it, I think, maybe messaging and encouraging applicants to come in and if we decide to not go forward with a full-blown technical review committee in its fully embodied way, to think about ways that we can get our priorities out there. I also wonder if there's also opportunity to maybe use some guidance documents, like, you know, in some other communities, they have some great handouts. You know, you want to do this thing, these are the 10 things you better think about and do before you walk in our door. And I think, you know, those are not necessarily ordinance revisions and stuff, but it's, you know, I think we have an opportunity to make the process efficient, which costs applicants less money, gets us where we want, and makes our process
And in
easier.
that regard on concept plans, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, I had a
Jess,
comment.
Jess, I'm just
from-
gonna take it off the screen so I can have it for the recording.
I didn't realize that was you. I thought it was me.
I had a comment from an attorney this week that the requirements for a concept plan review are so substantial that they almost equal site plan review, which I thought was not accurate, but I really haven't looked at it recently to see if that's accurate, you know. And if in fact that is true, then we should lessen it, because a concept plan review under 10.1 should not require as much documentation, so that an applicant says, I'm not going to do this, because even if they like it, I'm going to have to come back and do the same thing over again. And of course, just for the benefit of everybody here, and I'm sure the zoning board is aware of this, only planning boards can hear concept plan reviews. You can't go to a zoning board and say, what do you think of this use variance? John and I have had some attorneys
correct.
that
And by the way,
don't know that law and actually think you can do that.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure that technical coordinating committee could, on a Board of Adjustment application, could give informal advice to an applicant. But
Probably not.
probably not, but we're talking about the planning board.
Right.
Can I just comment on
Sure,
the
Jim.
TRC, because the past 4 years, I don't think
Mike.
I don't think there's been one TRC meeting.
I mean, one
That's-
informal concept.
Yeah, informal concept plan for an applicant. It's just something that it should be, there's gonna be one scheduled on Monday, but it's just hasn't been the normal course of procedure. We've had applicants, actually, a week ago, me, Karen Gilbert, and committee Bob King met with a potential developer, and we suggested that a TRC be, or concept review be scheduled, but it hasn't been required. It's always been that the township engineer and the township planner meet with the applicant as part of the checklist to go over any potential issues. And that's just how it's been done in Raritan Township for
We've
long
had
time.
our TRC committee that we volunteer for at the beginning of the year, Have you been reviewing anything, or have they just not
No,
called
it's
upon
only
you?
if the applicant requests.
It's
So
okay.
the last ones were when there were some concept plans floating around some affordable housing issues.
Okay.
And we looked at those, and there were some other rezoning discussion ones. Yeah, where the TRC subcommittee came in, but it was under that concept guide.
It strikes me that it might help to focus our discussion if we start with trying to define what it is we're trying to do. Are we just looking to clean up some inconsistencies or omissions that are in the present ordinances? Or are we looking to, and I don't say this with any intention to demean either board, but just shifting cases back and forth? Because that strikes me as not terribly helpful, but, you know, I mean, it helps you, it wouldn't help us, we can fight about that. But are we looking to start new processes? But if we can enunciate what it is we're trying to do, then maybe we can focus down into how to do it.
I would like to add to that, that I also think that we need to, like you said, think of what we want as the future. There are things coming up that are not covered. Airbnbs, cannabis. So I would like, are we doing this once and then we're still behind the 8 ball because businesses change? And then we're behind the 8 ball again. So I think we need to, what are we doing? What is the overall goal here? And I hate to say it, if it's really industrial and commercial, I think we're leaving out residential.
Here's the other thing that everyone should understand. Raritan has an ordinance provision that says if something's not expressly permitted in a zone, it is expressly prohibited. So
Yeah.
that's how the BOA gets a lot of their applications. Something comes in and it's not listed somewhere as expressly permitted, even though they might think it's the greatest idea, maybe they end up granting the D variance. But once someone needs a D variance, then you have a bunch of objectors also. Then you have a contested case that not only takes longer, but that's why, for example, my opinion, the Board of Adjustment ended up issuing that interpretation about the no multiple uses because no one ever focused on it until you had 30 objectors with 3 attorneys, and they ended up being right. And the Board of Adjustment did what I thought the law required and did that. But so you're always going to have that problem. But if you know about new uses, like Cynthia just said, then you guys decide. Do you want to leave that as not permitted? Because then you know it's end up here, or do you think you think an Airbnb is a good idea, so you want to make it permitted? But that's how you can get ahead of those things by saying those uses, thinking about them, and deciding if you want to make it permitted.
And that falls under the heading of problems that we have with the existing ordinance. Let's get a list and talk about it. And I totally agree with you. We need to look forward and anticipate as best we can.
Am I correct in assuming residential is only left off of this discussion because of the grant and the specificities of the grant process?
I'm sorry, I can't hear
She
you
wants
too
to know
well.
if residential was left out because the grant specified commercial.
Yeah, because it's economic development, I guess, and also there's only a certain size grant. It's a big ordinance, so if we did everything residential, it would be redoing the whole ordinance potentially. So, yeah.
If that's the case, what I'd like to say is I have one pet peeve. And I'd like to know if we could somehow make it general that one property shouldn't be treated special from the other. And my pet peeve is corner lots. I'm sorry, the people that have to come in because they have 2 front yards and they want to put a generator in and it's in the front yard. No, it's on the side. That to me just, they want to put a pool in. No, it's on the front yard. No, it's not. So that to me is the one. So if we can't do residential, can we at least somehow say one property shouldn't be
Put it in the annual
specific?
report, let the township committee.
I think we fixed that one, actually.
It's an
Like,
easy
yeah,
one,
yeah.
though. That is, you can do a secondary front yard, you can do exceptions.
Right.
there's all kinds of
Great,
stuff
that's
you
all I
can
care.
do.
Yes, we fixed that one.
Good, thank you.
If you do have a generator as a front yard, and if it's non-dominant, you can get a zoning permit and they just have to screen it with landscaping.
Excellent.
Yeah.
But I think, if I think back over, what have we learned in the last 3 years? I think the whole idea of the outdoor dining and thinking about how does that work into a business model and how do we permit that and start thinking about it. So what other things, do we need to think about now? Outdoor dining and other types of businesses where it's not a restaurant, but it may serve liquids or beverages
Mhm.
and a milkshake shop or, whatever that wants to put out outdoor. Is that dining if they're just drinking liquids? We have to think about like silly stuff like that.
Mhm.
But I think let's think about what are the big areas where, we'd like to start thinking about things.
Yeah, I think some of that really came up when we started doing these outdoor dining ordinances is like, well, if a deli puts out a picnic table, is that outdoor dining? If they're just doing someone sits at their sandwich, now it's outdoor dining. Do they,
Yeah.
do we regulate that? Do we not regulate that? So that's a very valid point.
I may be fresh in my mind from last evening's meeting, but I'll just mention warehouses not being popular and it was quite the meeting that you all missed. However, I would recommend that we strongly look at what we define as warehouses.
And
Going
in
along
what,
with
what,
what-
and in what zones?
Yeah,
Warehouse
And
and
there
what
might,
zone,
and-
and there is new state guidance, on large warehouses, and I think it's good to,
we have a
definitely good to
proposal.
think about and,
There's a proposal now where it's bordering a school, a neighborhood, and a church. Yeah, no. Well, but we.
If it came in
but-
front of
but-
us,
but-
I would vote no.
Well, but we voted that it's not inconsistent, and we recommended to committee that it's, so
Yeah, I think, Jessica,
What,
what the
you voted
concern
no?
is in what,
Yeah, but it
what
wasn't a
zone
warehouse,
should
it was
they
a
be allowed?
redevelopment zone.
right,
it's
warehouses
like-
in general, or?
It's particularly large warehouses,
Large
and
warehouses, yeah,
maybe in
that's
certain
what I mean.
zones they're allowed, they shouldn't be allowed.
Well, could warehousing be conditional?
I don't even know in certain zones that would make people happy living around it.
To go along with what Robin said,
yeah.
one of the areas where we've seen some issues are where you have a commercial zone that butts up with a residential zone. And I can think of two cases where we've had this room almost full of objectors. And they're hard issues to resolve because you've got people who don't want to be looking at a commercial property when previously it had been a woods. And you have the tree huggers who don't want the trees cut down. You have the people who, we actually had one woman who wanted to know how we were going to pick up all of the animals, catch them, and then release them in another location where they could be safe. And regardless of what people's issues are, they're going to have issues being up against an undeveloped commercial property. And I think that's going to be a potential issue. Cynthia was talking about looking down the road. That's where we're going to have issues in the future. Because we all know that we're no longer a new community.
Yeah.
We're a more mature community. And so now a lot of the development is occurring on pieces of property that aren't prime development property. They've got zoning issues, variances that are needed, and very often they are going to be butting up against residential zones. And I foresee that as a big problem down the road.
I would,
So
I would
what-
add to that the other round of Mount Laurel that's coming our
Yes.
way, right? So if we take a look at the zoning map and we look at where are the lines where we have residential butting up against zoned areas, whether developed or not, that would be considered non-residential, and I don't know all the numbers and letters, but.
And of course, Raritan has always taken on more than its fair share, for lack of a better word, no pun intended, of Mount Laurel projects, because this is where the growth in the county has been centered. So, I mean, I'll defer to John Drill because he's more of an
No,
expert on
I
Mount
agree.
Laurel than me, but the more you encourage growth and have these projects, what impact does that have for our 10-year round obligation in 2025?
Is there anything for like that warehouse that's coming up, being that it's against residential properties in a school and a church? Is there anything that prevents us from voting no?
Here's the bottom line. Is it
In the
permitted?
meeting?
in that
It's
redevelopment?
permitted, and so it went through as an area in need of redevelopment that was not inconsistent.
And as Jeff Cool and a number of my board chairmen always say, when these applications come before the planning board and there's a room full of screaming people, that we're not a legislative body as a board.
That's
Our-
right.
Our duty is to apply the ordinance, and a permitted use under Pizzo versus Manton, Randolph
Yeah.
Township, the courts have said essentially is
Gotta
an
read-
approval of
Right.
right use unless there's an issue related to public health, safety, and
And
general
only if it's in an
welfare.
ordinance.
Right, so,
Only, if- right? And if
Right.
it complies with the ordinance,
right,
if you deny it, you're gonna get reversed. And that's one of the things. So, for example, if, again, I keep on harping on this, but if flex space is not a problem, then make it permitted so that you don't have a problem with that particular zone. If you have any use that you would be troubled about, like a warehouse, then you can do the opposite. I know this is supposed to be promoting economic development, but if you have some use, even though it might promote economic development, it's going to give your residents a problem, make it prohibited, to send it to the Board of Adjustment.
Well, there's
Maybe
so
over
many
a
of them
certain
that have been
size or
approved already.
conditional, like Jeff
Well,
said, which is
conditional.
more
If
likely.
you meet the
you know.
conditions, you guys get it and you have to approve it. If it doesn't meet a condition, it goes to the Board of Adjustment. For a D3 instead of a D1 variance.
What would be conditional?
You have some conditional uses now. For
Right.
example,
Yeah, it could be-
a gas station
Okay.
is a conditional use. You have to meet all the conditions. If you meet all the conditions, then you guys can grant site plan approval and conditional use approval. If it doesn't, it's not a C variance, it's a D variance, and it goes to these guys. And it's a higher standard that the
So-
applicant has to satisfy.
For example, a conditional use ordinance relating to warehouses might put a limit on square footage. It might put a limit on,
Neighboring property?
yes,
Or truck
Neighboring
generation,
properties
number of trucks.
that it's a conditional use unless it abuts a residential property, so.
Correct. And
So
then if
these
they
are
meet-
all things that other towns have.
So last night
on.
could have been a lot smoother. So you're telling me.
Well, I think this is where we need to, move forward.
Yep.
And think about what some of these
Clearly.
opportunities, challenges, and threats are, and what do we want to do that makes our community, I think to me, tying it back to the knowledge of, well, our township has gone above and beyond with our affordable housing, and we should be proud of that. We've diversified our community. But at the same time, other development that's taking place is going to generate what little remaining open parcels we have left are going to be constrained. And we don't want to have no parcels left, affordable housing being told that we have to have new numbers and everything's now industrial or commercial.
And sewer is always an issue.
Well, we're out. We don't have any.
Can we consider, with, listening to the warehouse, and I'm thinking of our other one that we're working on now. Can we consider landscaping a conditional? Because
Anything
one of
you want. you
one
can
of the
make.
things that in one of the applications we have today, it's very challenging for me because in this particular case, they're wiping out, it reminds me of, I don't want to be derogatory, Edison, Route 1. It's, if you know the area, it's just business after business after business. In this particular application we have, has multiple uses, and if we're going to do warehouses, if we're going to do flex space, if we can do conditional, heavy on landscaping, at least maybe they'll be attractive.
You could absolutely add landscaping as one of the conditional use requirements. That's no question about it.
Which raises another issue that I think is important to all of us. I came home the day of Hurricane Ian and found out 2 weeks later that I knew three people who were drowned in that particular instance, and one who hung onto a tree for 6 hours. And I was shocked. And I know that we've talked about taking impervious coverage and actually reducing. And I'm wondering if maybe we shouldn't be thinking the other way, because I'm thinking of the fact that it appears that climate change is definitely with us. And look what's going on in California right now. The same thing could be happening here with hurricanes and with the Neshaminy Creek and the Raritan River and all of its branches. We have to be prepared for that, because for the first time, we've had a 1,000-year storm. We've never had a 1,000-year storm. I've lived here since '88, and that's the worst storm I remember in terms of, the kind of damage it did because of running water.
Yeah.
And I think all of us are aware of it, but somehow we have to factor that in as well, because that goes along with what Cynthia said. I think that's looking down the road.
I just, and I don't want to minimize, I just hate to lose the beauty of, like I said, the one application we're looking at, it's upsetting to me, just from looking at that property and how much is gone and how much it looks.
Yeah, it's not tough.
So I just like the beauty of the trees. And if we're going to do warehouse, we're going to do flex space, we're going to do any commercial, I think landscaping should be heavily looked at.
Aren't there new stormwater regulations coming? Because, I mean, that's what you're talking about, right?
You know,
Yeah.
and they're here.
And I agree, that's
Yeah.
always been a major
Yeah,
issue for
He's
us.
going a step further. He's
Yeah.
not saying, stormwater regulations are what to do with the water that's coming off. What Roger's saying is the opposite of what I said. I said, increase the amount of impervious coverage allowed to cut down some of the cases. What Roger is saying is decrease the amount, so you don't have as much water runoff, and if the BOA has to get more cases, we've got to, they've only denied 2 of about like 15.
Yeah, at least 15.
Okay, so maybe maybe they end up denying more. That's what Roger's saying.
What is the
There's
difference
a lot
between
of things that we
residential and
can do to
commercial?
reduce water
Can we
runoff
up it
on
in commercial?
residential and industrial.
You also-
Small
I
things
mean,
that we can
reduce it
encourage
in
to
industrial and
keep water
commercial?
on the
We
individual
still
site
raise
rather
it on the
than running
residential
into
so that
ditches
it
where
reduces their load?
Yeah, you could do that.
anybody's listening.
Sorry,
Next-
no, I.
Two of them.
I missed what you said, because I heard him, but
I was saying that we can up the residential, we can do it different depending on what zone it is.
Yeah.
You can reduce it on these big warehouses and commercial properties and industrial properties. So you know what? They're not gonna be able to build so big. Sorry, go somewhere else. And you could up it.
find Alternatives, as you said, that allow less impervious coverage, maybe by using other media.
I mean, there's simple things, you know,
Right.
Rain gardens or, you know,
Yes,
anything
yes.
to keep rain on the property and sink into the
Well,
ground.
didn't we
rather
have one
than-
application where the
I know
actual
it's a simple-
pavement?
Yeah, but just so
Was-
you know, what the Board of
Perfect.
Adjustment has done, when they've granted these impervious coverage variances, they imposed a condition saying that they have to put those things in. Okay?
so they're there.
They're putting them in to
That's good,
mitigate,
yeah.
but if you lowered the amount of impervious coverage, you wouldn't even have to talk about mitigating it. You wouldn't be allowing it. And Michelle's suggestion, I think, it's a good one. If you decrease the amount in a commercial area, even though that's contrary to encouraging business, that's gonna, normally, that impervious generates a lot more stormwater than on these homeowner
Residentials, and we can raise it on the homeowner.
Well, there's
Raise it
also,
residential.
and I'll give you an example where I'm township attorney in Bernards Township, and you're probably familiar with it, John, because
I'm
you're
a
on the
planning
planning
board.
board attorney. So John and I work together in more than just one town, but there was a Toll Brothers development, Canterbury, and it was 1 acre zoning, and people came in and put these big houses in that the developer sold, and then all of a sudden they realized when they wanted to do a swimming pool or something
Big
like that,
patio.
they were above impervious coverage. And so the board was requiring them to remove certain things to get below impervious coverage. But there should be an expectation by a homeowner when they buy a house and there's an impervious coverage ratio, that if you want a pool or something else that pushes it over, that's something you should take into account when you're buying the house.
I don't want to give the complicating factor to the public. I will tell you one of the other issues is a former employee, not Tony Bajar, who may have granted some zoning permits when that person shouldn't. Leave it at that.
well, I think so the big bucket is, let's look at our impervious coverage in our zones so that we can decide on how to best preserve our natural resources, reduce stormwater management and flooding. Those types of things, I think, would be really good. I think the other thing is the balancing, you know, if we're still trying to look at how do we encourage business development, there is floor area ratio. So that's the other way, you know,
I'm sorry, what did you say?
floor area ratio, you give higher buildings, you know, and so there might be places where we want something or some type of use and we play around with that a little bit.
Yeah, and just to touch on the stormwater issue, some of what the applicants had to go to the Board of Adjustment to get a C variance if they exceeded 20%. There was a recommendation to then have it to go to 27%, and if they don't exceed it, the 27%, they would have to go to the board, but they would have to do mitigation. And right now, they can go administratively and provide a stormwater plan, and it gets reviewed without the board. So that's one thing that kind of, stormwater is still required, but it's
Yeah,
something that.
the soil scientist in my background goes, oh no, because we do
The
know.
floor
it's-
area,
it's-
but the floor area ratio is a great idea, because
Yeah.
if you increase the floor area ratio, they can go up. And it saves on the impervious coverage. You just have to be willing.
Well, that's
to go
the
up.
delicate dance. But stormwater, we know we have chronic flooding problems in our township. We have to be really serious about our stormwater management and not getting permeability testing, not making sure the site can really accept the stormwater. We may be able to use that natural environment constraint that they can't get their stormwater properly treated and managed according to the state rules. They don't get a project.
Right.
I mean, that's the reality. And by not knowing that before, I've heard stories of an applicant that dug their whole property up to try and find permeability. So, we have to think about that. And that's where I think, it's all part of the puzzle.
Is there like a overall, because back to this warehouse issue that everybody's up in arms over. Is there like an overall percentage of warehousing that can be allowed in the town? Like, we've just approved so many of these things, probably in better locations than these now newer ones that are coming up closer and closer to things we don't want them up against. Like, is there a limit to how many, like,
No, it's a-
well, they beat you to it, so
Whatever
they're getting built.
the zoning is.
Yeah, it depends on the zoning ordinance.
Yeah.
We need to fix the zoning.
So the way you modify it is change your zoning.
Then I think that definitely needs to be done. Stop all the arguing.
Something that I heard you say, Jeff, and I want to make sure we address it, is you said, I think, a buffer zone or a buffer, so that you could have maybe certain businesses in a business zone that are adjacent to a residence. Only certain businesses are allowed on that property. That's something that we could do?
It is in our ordinance,
Okay.
isn't it?
We have a buffer requirement,
Landscaping buffer. yeah.
landscape
but-
buffer.
No, I'm not talking about a landscaping buffer. I'm talking about a buffer zone, as in only certain businesses are allowed to be on properties that are adjacent to residences.
Conditional use, is that?
That would be,
The answer is yes. If they want to do that, you could prohibit, you could have, let's say, the B1 zone, right? Right now, your ordinance says you have a whole list of things allowed in the B1. You could then say prohibited uses, and you could list of the permitted, the following are prohibited if they're within X number of feet of a residential zone. That's what he's asking. Yeah, they have the
That's what we wanna
authority to
do.
do that.
And the one thing for commercial zones is that if you are adjacent to a residential zone, you cannot do 24-hour operation.
We've run into.
that one we've run into, yeah.
Yeah.
We denied one of those a few years ago
Right.
because
And that's the whole reason they lost their
Wawa
lawsuit against us.
agreed to, an
Denial.
hour limitation.
That was the first one.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The first
Yeah.
Wawa.
The first, yeah.
Wawa one.
The easy one.
2019,
easy
or was it?
It's 2019, but about 99%.
All right, I'm gonna sit down with a highlighter, of all the residential, and all the commercial that are touching each other. 'Cause I think if we knew what we're dealing with there, that's gonna be important for us to look at.
I can prepare that. afterwards.
Yeah,
It's easy to.
okay.
So clearly lots of ideas. Jessica, how do we translate these needs, these real needs, into actions? And then also what goes into this document? Obviously, there's other documents get affected as well.
So,
Great segue into your plan for completion of the project.
Yep.
oh, I'm not on. It's on my screen, but not yours.
Kudos to the chairman.
Thanks for the parking lot too. That's good discipline.
Is that on?
Almost.
Gotta put on the show.
There
Give
you
it a
go.
minute.
Okay, there it is. All right, so what we'd like to do is establish a subcommittee to bring in all these ideas and have a small group to bounce the ideas off. And then we'll do some draft revisions with that group. And then we would be bringing it back to the governing body for review. And if it gets introduced, then it would be back at the planning board as always for consistency review with the master plan. So that's really the process from this point on. So I'd be happy to entertain if anyone.
There might be some priorities. I'm hearing from the mayor that perhaps should be fast-tracked more than others.
One in particular.
Yeah.
Okay.
We
I
will talk
absolutely
to you
agree.
offline.
Yes, please.
Um,
I mean, and this isn't the only place you can give, if you feel like you want to give input to any of us, Jeff and I in particular, at any point in time, feel free to.
The draft that we're looking at, though, is the September 2021 that was prepared, right? That we were sent a while back.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the initial
Yeah,
draft.
so that's the one we should be looking at in terms of what's in it.
And we'll be revising it based on input from this evening and based on input from the subcommittee.
Jessica, do you have a time frame? I know you said that there's no set deadline on this grant, that it has to be completed.
There is a
by-
deadline. I have to figure out exactly when it's going to be. It's going to be a relatively quick process. I'm not going to say it's going to drag on for months and months.
How quickly do you see us moving through these phases of the project to completion?
About 3 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
John, do you have an opinion on approach or?
Do you think it would go faster if you work off that last draft, or just, depending on the feedback you get, you just take the existing ordinance and you start from scratch, basically?
Yeah, we may do that too.
I think it'd be
Well, I
faster,
mean-
quite frankly, if you start from scratch, because there's a lot of stuff in that thing that I have a feeling the committee's gonna be going, no, 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 no.
In
So
the
instead of-
draft?
Yeah, so instead of crossing out, you just start 2019 with the yes, yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. I mean, I think I would want to just reconvene with the subcommittee, talk to them about what we want to put in, and then, go from there.
You can decide which way would go faster.
Yeah, what are the priority? We'll get more into the actual details. It take a little more time and be a little more cleaner with a smaller group, then it's a little. Cumbersome.
Not for this particular meeting, because the administrator has indicated we shouldn't talk about specific ordinances. But I can tell the board that you had asked the professionals to look at the minor site plan ordinance.
Right.
And we actually have a draft of an ordinance with input from Jessica, Paul Ferrero, Jeff, and also we've been keeping the chairman and vice chairwoman on board, because one of the things that the planning board has been seeing, because of the minor site plan ordinances, is people that really have things that are site plans coming in and trying to say, oh, this is a minor. And when we looked at our ordinance, we realized it didn't provide clear guidance. So we've come up with a draft that would provide a clear guidance. So if you really are a minor site plan, you can do that. But if you really need preliminary and final site plan approval, then you can't come in here, because we have local attorneys coming in all the time saying, this is a minor. And Donna knows, and it's like, no, that's not a minor, right? That's a me. So just to keep this board up to speed, that's probably something you'll see coming down the road on that specific
And
ordinance.
here's one other thing. So Clinton Township, where I represent the planning board and the board of adjustment, they went through this with the Hunterdon County. Either the
Same thing.
same thing
Yeah,
a couple
same
years
thing.
ago. What they came up with was mind-boggling, radical, but great, and so far it's worked. They have commercial site plan exemptions for generator, if you meet certain requirements, for upgrading site lighting to LED, you're not changing the heights, for cell tower swap outs, upgrades, you're not adding any height to the pole. If you meet certain, you can go to the zoning officer. Now, it's just to have some checks and balances. All those exemptions are sent to the chairman of the planning board to review, to make sure that he or she is comfortable with it. If they're not comfortable with it, then they make them submit a minor site plan. But that would really speed along and cut down,
That's a neat idea.
We do have a provision for site plan exceptions if you meet the zoning
But
requirements.
the
You
three-
do not have to.
right, but the three things I mentioned, under the current wording of the exemption, if you get a generator without going
to get a minor site plan approval?
It meets zoning requirements, and it's not,
Yeah, we haven't seen any of those.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming you're just getting issued
unless it's in the resolution. that says-
administratively.
There are some exemptions.
I'm not talking, I'm talking about someone, they come in, they have an approval, it's not a generator, they come back later, or a business that was approved 10 years ago, now they want a generator. How about the cell tower upgrades? Can that be done administratively in Raritan Township?
No, just co-locations.
How about upgrading the lights, not increasing the height of the fixtures, but putting in LED lamps? Can you get an exemption for that in Raritan Township?
It applies.
A lot of the cell towers are federal law.
Someone should check, those are things you can check, and you can think of others, but that would help commercial development, and it would go to neither board. And some things like that, why do they have to go to the board?
Well, they haven't been coming to us because we haven't seen
We
those.
haven't seen
They
it.
have,
Cell towers, lot towers.
Yeah, they haven't. We don't see those.
They were coming for a while,
Yeah.
but then they slowed down.
talking about the co-locations.
Yeah.
Yeah, because now it's done.
Right. So just
There may be other opportunities
Correct.
beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, federal, you do. Federal law tied our hands as to.
Well, no, it doesn't. Federal law, in my opinion, it doesn't mandate administrative. You can do it.
I think we've been doing that and leaving it to discretion
Right. You should,
in-house as to, okay, this looks fine.
right. You should just make it formalize what's being done informal. And maybe add some.
Whatever.
Anybody care to be on our subcommittee?
Yeah, I'd like to throw in on that.
You would?
I would.
And Donna?
Jessica, I'll be on.
Okay.
We got
How
the
many
chair
do
and
we
vice-
have? 3 and 3?
Chair and vice chair of the BOA, any chair pro temp or not?
Anybody who would like to, if you could
Two or
just raise
three.
your hand so I can
You
have
got
it
the-
on record.
As long as it's
Well-
not a quorum for either board.
Yeah. as long
You
as
got the
it's-
board and vice chair of the board.
Chair and vice chair. We have chair, vice chair, James.
Unless someone wants it more than me. I think it'd be
Perfect.
interesting.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank
So
you.
we'll coordinate to get
It's
a
gonna
meeting
cost you a lot of
together.
money, Joseph. It's gonna cost you a lot of money.
How do you propose doing this?
I'm sorry?
How do you propose the next steps of us meeting? I know it's always easier to do over Zoom. I always think it's more productive in person, but I don't want to.
I'm open to probably in person, just because it might get a little clumsy with Zoom. I mean, if somebody wants to Zoom in, I'm not opposed to that.
I think if Zoom's an option,
Yeah,
it helps.
and I don't know if people are available afternoons, maybe.
So why don't we do it availability and time
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
subcommittee
well,
and then
I'll have
figure out what works.
Taylor- I'll lean on Taylor a
That's
little
why I'm
bit to
not
help
volunteering,
us to
I'm not
figure out
available
when
during the
people are
day.
available.
I'm with you. I prefer a person, but I'll do Zoom. if That's what it is.
I'm tired of Zoom, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone really can't, I'm not opposed to bringing my laptop and helping them Zoom in, but we can try to do it in person.
Afternoons are difficult, I think, for Cynthia, because she's still working and she's working almost a double shift.
Oh,
So
right.
for me, it's not a problem.
Yeah, I just need enough notice and then I'm gonna block it out.
Yeah, okay.
I
Probably
just-
looking at a few weeks.
Yeah,
The next few weeks.
yeah, it'll be relatively quickly.
Well, I'm still working, but I can carve out time.
Okay.
I'd much rather it be in person, but I may
Yeah.
have to fall
Well,
back
that's
to
good to
Zoom.
know that most people would rather be in person but we will accommodate anyone who needs to be on Zoom. Okay.
Can I raise one other issue? I came here in '88 when the hospital decided that they needed a professional fundraiser to raise the money to build the hospital. And driving up here from my farm in Bucks County, I couldn't help but notice the number of abandoned properties as you drive along 202 and some of the other main thoroughfares. For those of you that go back a number of years, like Randy, some of you remember Taylor Cadillac. the
Taylor
building-
Chevrolet.
Taylor Chevrolet. The building sat there for years
Mm.
until it finally collapsed. And then they forced them to finally take it down. Have we ever considered any kind of ordinances to deal with the length of time that you can allow a dilapidated building to continue to stand? I think all of you can probably think of a couple commercial and a couple of residential properties along 202 and 31 that have just sat for years. And, obviously, the owner is waiting for them to be bought up and developed. But in the meantime, it makes we live in the 5th wealthiest county in the United States. And at times it looks like, we're in Appalachia. And I know that part of the problem is that we have a borough and a township. And, some things get by in the borough that don't get by in the township and vice versa. But I just am puzzled by the fact that people seem to be allowed to just leave derelict buildings standing for so long. No one ever does anything about it. I can only think of one or two that have ever been torn down. One was the scuba shop over near the Ramada.
Yep.
And I'm sure all of
That's what
you
it is
can
now.
think of at least one or two.
Roger, the parachute one is still up
Yeah,
in standard.
that is the one I'm thinking
Yeah.
I
of.
mean, we've addressed graffiti. I know I've personally let Jeff know, like, go have Applebee's cleaned up. Like, who owns that
Yeah,
place?
so
You know, we do.
Township does have a commercial ordinance for maintenance, and as far as vacant or dilapidated housing, there is a provision that if it's for sale or for rent, or if there's a for sale sign or if it's on the market, then there are certain exceptions to enforce. So that's one issue. But, there is a commercial maintenance.
And this goes back to Cynthia's point, and that is, we live in a beautiful township. I think all of us want to keep it that way.
Yep.
And I just, at times find those eyesores really troubling.
So is our restrictions, are they not being enforced? Or is it
I think
just
your
we
ordinance is
can't
fine.
do anything about it? Is
Your
it a
ordinance
legal
fine.
thing?
Is it-
So
You need someone to enforce it.
I won't speak of the property site, but there's one in particular where we have fined them, and over a decade, they don't pay a dime. And, now we have this lovely legal back and forth. And so, yes, we've tried to enforce.
We're in litigation on that one, so we won't mention the name on that.
No, I'm
No.
not.
It was years.
But when
to-
I found out that we kept fining them and they weren't paying a dime, I said, why haven't we sued them?
Right.
Like, this is ridiculous. So,
Is there
we
anything
do
we can do the
escalate.
opposite way?
pardon
An
me?
ordinance that promotes the renovation and is there any?
Those are redevelopments, right? Or
That's
or is
really
that
the
different?
redevelopment
Yeah.
process. So
Okay.
if you see something like that, that is one way to incentivize,
Yeah.
Mhm.
is to designate it as an area in need of redevelopment and try to, bring a developer in to
Yeah.
buy and
Which is
redevelop.
what we
Other
did, it
option-
ended up with a warehouse.
Yeah, other options though for property maintenance and facade improvement, and those type of things. I just got done reviewing a lot of economic development stuff for some towns, and they have small mini grants. They have, there may be some small businesses that are kind of on the edge that, you can do that type of thing as well. So that's not redevelopment. It's not as big and scary for the change, but, that costs tax dollars.
Sure does.
So,
Let's not bring up tax.
so.
I guess I only have one last question. I don't know. I understand and I think it's a state law that the breweries cannot have eateries on site. And so there's nothing we could do to promote because we would be breaking the state ordinance. Is that what we're saying?
You could let them have food trucks maybe.
Right,
but
let 'em
yeah,
have
it's a
food trucks,
state
but-
law.
Correct.
They
But
can't sell it,
the
but you
municipalities are
bring it in.
preempted by that state
by the
law.
ABC.
Okay.
Yeah, and then that's a whole other liquor license.
Yeah, they're looking
Yeah,
at
I don't
liquor
know.
licenses now,
Which applies.
right, the governor is.
Okay.
The way they got around the restaurant lobby by allowing microbrewery licenses was to not allow food.
So it's
Yeah, but I'm tired of going to Philly for breweries.
Yeah, it's great. Just
Well, you
drink a
can
lot
have-
of beer with
You
no
have food
food.
delivered. I
It's a
mean,
great idea.
local breweries here don't mind if you have food delivered if you bring in food. It's just
Okay.
they don't have it
They
And food
can't.
trucks will park outside.
Correct, yeah,
correct.
so
S-
they find
independently owned.
workarounds.
Okay,
But I thought we had ordinances that were pretty restrictive on food trucks.
What's that?
They only do, they're only allowed to have food trucks there a certain number of times a year and blah, 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 blah.
Right.
But
So
that
I-
might be a small business development thing that we
Yes.
might want to think about looking at, or, because it is something that, food trucks, pop-up events and eateries, those types of things, those kind of temporary things that come in from an economic development perspective.
You have to be careful that your restaurant owners don't get,
Sometimes they're the ones that are doing it.
Find a way to make it easy, but not infringe on the brick and mortar restaurants.
Sometimes they want to have a
Like make sure
dinner
they
on-
can't park their
dinner on
truck
the
in front of
farm.
a brick and mortar restaurant.
Right, yeah.
And they can't do it because we won't give them a health.
Don't we have like the brewery that has like the restaurant right next door? I haven't actually been over there, but
So we
over
have
on,
Conclave in Raritan Township, Flemington Borough has Lomego.
oh, okay, it's Borough.
the Board of Adjustment approved. a brewery.
Conclave.
Conclave.
Conclave. yeah.
Conclave.
So is that the one next to a restaurant? It has-
No.
No, I was thinking it's
No,
Flemington.
I just have food delivered. I'm like, I'll meet you in the Conclave park. Where the picnic tables are.
Because it seems to be a good idea if you have a brewery to
You would-
have a restaurant next door.
Absolutely.
Get around everything there. You just walk wherever you want.
Yeah, but we don't really have a main, it's hard. We
In the
don't have,
borough of Lebanon, that's what they have.
yeah,
A brewery,
Yeah.
and a restaurant. right
yeah.
next to it.
We don't have like a downtown
Yeah.
to maximize.
No, they don't either. We just did it in
Rely on the borough.
Certain route.
shopping center. Yeah, right on Route 22.
Oh, I know what you're talking about now.
All right.
Well, I think we all agree this was very productive. I want to
Yeah.
thank our vice chair who surfaced the idea here for this working meeting, and thank you all for making the time out of your busy schedules to be
Thank
here
you.
tonight. And Jessica and Jeff, thanks for being prepared as always.
Yeah.
So
thank you.
now on to the real work.
Actually, Lance, that report you were asking for, it is on our website.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think we're done. There's no chairman's report. Board comments, any more than what we've already had? No? Engineers' comments? Anything else this evening? Planners' comments? I think you've done that. Attorneys' comments?
No, thank you.
Okay. Next meeting is April 12th. Sounds like we've got a bunch of stuff coming, Jeff, but
2 applications. that have
hopefully with stormwater
carried, but
No.
We will
Or
update you on the storm.
and complete.
Well, they have been deemed complete, so it's
Yes,
gonna be
but-
heard.
It's flying
They
back.
did submit a stormwater plan. It's being reviewed right now.
Okay,
We beat them up enough, so,
good. Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Roger, we don't have a meeting next week, right?